I love sleep. Like, if it was a person, I would marry it. Or at least date it seriously for a long period of time. It's seriously my favorite thing to do. And half of my time is just made up of me thinking about when I'll get to go back to sleep. At this point, though, I can't tell if it's because sleep truly is a heavenly, relaxing experience, or if I'm just that much more appreciative of it now that my kids ensure that I get less of it. And I'm one of the lucky ones. One of those moms whose kids took well to sleep training and goes to bed fairly easily. Yet I still have my sleep deprivation stories. We all do. And as my guest this week will make abundantly clear, those are nothing at all to laugh at. I'm Ariana Bradford, and this is the NYAM Project Podcast. Hey everyone, what's up? As I've mentioned, I'm Ariana, and this is the NYAM Project Podcast, and you're listening to episode 16. Mama just wants some sleep. Just a heads up, this is our last episode for the year, so stick around to the end for a quick message about that. And in the meantime, let's talk about sleep. Or rather, the lack thereof. My guest this week, Barney, is one of my nearest and dearest friends, and she's been a member of NYAM from the beginning. Her article about sleep deprivation and its effect on her as a new mother is still one of our most popular and most widely shared articles, and it's not without very good reason. It's time you got to know a little bit more about her and what she stands for.
I'm Barney, and I like to say that I'm from Austin, but I currently live in a little tiny suburb north of Austin. I have one child, and will only ever have one child. Beautiful little girl named Charlie. Also, go Charlies! Yay, Charlies!
Hey, Charlie!
I'm a second grade teacher, which I love. As exhausting as it is, it means I have my one kid plus about 20 others. And yeah, I'm just kind of not your average mom.
That's an understatement. Thank you for the name drop.
Threw that in there.
That's awesome of you. Yeah, because you were one of the first moms I worked with on this, so you know.
And it's the ground floor, as they like to say.
Yeah, you're one of the people who helped with the initial idea. As a matter of fact, I think like I talked to you about the initial idea first. Like I was like, I have this idea for a project, and you were like, okay, I don't care.
And then it's gone so many amazing places since then.
I know, it's grown a lot. It's kind of weird. It's like watching my kid grow and move out and go to college. It's kind of creepy. Speaking of kids, so Charlie is how old now? She's 3, 4?
4. She turned 4 in October. Yep, just turned 4.
Yeah. And you mentioned that she is your only child. Have you been dealing with like any static from that? Like, do people bother you about the fact that you've only chose to have one child?
There's always the like, when are you going to have another one is always the next question. And then people kind of look at me cross-eyed when I'm like, absolutely never. That's not, I think, the anticipated response. So not so much pushback as just kind of general astonishment. People are always kind of a little surprised. And I think they think I'm joking a lot of the times, and I'm really not.
Why would you be joking about that? It's not even a funny joke. Like, it's like, right? No, I'm not.
But the look on people's faces is always just kind of bemused, like, oh, haha, one, haha. So yeah, I don't know what it is, but people are always a little bit shocked that.
And you're like, no, I'm dead serious. Like, come on. Yeah. What led you to that decision, by the way, to have one kid? Because I already know part of it.
Right. So, and part of it was that I was always okay with the idea of one kid, even before we had Charlie. I was an only child. My dad was an only child. My husband is the youngest of 3 by a lot. He's like 7 years younger than his middle brother and 10 years younger than his oldest. So for part of his upbringing, he was kind of an only child. And so it was never really a foreign concept to me. Like it was never a negative thing to me. I had a good experience as an only child, so I didn't think I was going to be causing harm to a kid by just having one. And then after we had Charlie, she did not sleep ever. Is still not the world's best sleeper.
I remember that battle.
And I really don't know. Yeah, it was really brutal in a lot of ways. It was like I was not prepared for what lack of sleep can do to a human being.
No. How long did that battle last, by the way? How long did that last?
So the real poor sleep was the first solid year. She didn't sleep for longer than about 2 hours at a stretch. Until she was 1. And then between 1 and 2, she would sleep 3.5 hours, 4 hours at a time. So we were getting up 2 or 3 times at night. And then finally, after about 2.5, she started only waking up once a night. But then she would go back, she would swing back and forth into those periods of like real frequent wake ups, which was almost kind of worse after it would get better for a little bit, because you got used to what sleep felt like. And then
you're like, no.
No, I remember.
This is
and so it was just that was
flashbacks.
Oh, it's honestly, I genuinely have like some trauma associated with it. Like I still have sleep anxiety where it's really hard for me to fall asleep because I spent years knowing that as soon as I fell asleep, I was going to be woken back up and have to go through the entire cycle again. And it really, really like it did a number on my psyche. And I tell people I don't think I would survive another one. And again, it's one of those things that they think I'm joking. And I'm like, I'm really not joking. It's actually very serious. I don't think I would survive another one.
It's not a joke.
It's not a joke. Like, look in my eyes. Do you see this level of crazy only comes from somebody who's deeply serious? But yeah, it was really, really hard. And nobody can promise me that the second one wouldn't be exactly the same. And I cannot do to myself and everybody around me what I did during that period of time. It just was not pretty for anybody.
Right? You would wind up you would wind up moving to another country, like without telling us. We'd never know where you went. We'd be like, well, Bonnie's gone.
I would enter myself into some kind of baby protection program and move across the country, get a wig. I don't know, grow some inches. I don't know. I would do a lot. I would do anything. Nobody can promise me. And I think that's like
a wig and a false mustache on.
Go full on Boris from Rocky and Bullwinkle, like Boris and Natasha. Just
exactly. With a terrible Russian
accent.
Just like, I don't know who you are.
In Soviet Russia, baby sleeps you.
Baby sleeps you. Oh, I've missed you.
I have missed you too, my friend. No, and then like, so the other thing too with having another one is like having one is so stressful. Like just the fear of not knowing anything going into it, like that was a real big thing for me and Evan. Like just the uncertainty of like nobody can make any promises about any of it. Nobody can guarantee you anything about your pregnancy or about early infancy or about the safety and security and health of that child, like becoming a toddler. And then, it's just, nobody can make any promises, and that's terrifying. Exactly. None of it. And it's scary. And I'm already like a ball of anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah, same. So, yeah.
Bonnie's struggles with sleep are well documented. Like I said, she wrote a whole damned article on it. But despite her very thorough descriptions of the anger and the tiredness and the frustration, there's still so much more to that story.
So actually, one of my favorite articles that you wrote for the website was about your sleep deprivation. So can you talk a little bit more about that in detail? Because I feel like so many people need to hear that they are not alone in the whole sleep deprivation thing, because it does so much more to you mentally than a lot of people think it does.
It really does. And it's one of those things that I don't think that people talk about as much as they should in real terms.
Right.
There's there's a lot of kind of lighthearted humor around the lack of sleep that new moms get, where people tell you stuff like, oh, sleep now when you're pregnant. You know, it's sleep now, save it up for when the baby's here.
Right.
And it doesn't work like that, surprisingly enough. Like, you can't save up sleep. And it really, there were times that because I worked too. So after I had Charlie, I took 12 weeks off of work. I was still working as a teacher, and I was commuting about 45 minutes each way to work. And so I would leave the house at about 5:30 to drop her off so that I could get to work before rush hour traffic hit. And there were times that I would get to work and not be fully aware of how I had gotten there. Like, I couldn't remember the drive because I was so sleep deprived that it was just, I don't know that I was fully conscious for all of the drives. Like, and I would just get to work and think whatever higher power might be that nobody was dead. Like, I was half a person. I wasn't fully human for a long time. Like, I felt like I was a zombie. I felt like I couldn't enjoy my job. I couldn't enjoy my child. I couldn't enjoy my husband. I was really bitter. I felt resentful towards everybody and everything. And it was all because I didn't get any sleep. I was just so tired. It made everything harder. Like, and then you blamed yourself for not fixing your baby because everybody else's baby seems to be sleeping perfectly. And nobody can tell you how to fix yours, or they give you 5,000 pieces of advice and none of it works. And it makes you wonder, like, what am I doing wrong to create this situation? And then you get angry at your kid. Like, there were nights that I would go in there, she would be awake for like the third or fourth time, and I would be functioning on 5 hours total of fragmented sleep over the past couple of days. And I would go in and just scream at her and just like collapse sobbing. It was really like, you feel like a monster because now you're screaming at an infant, right? Now you're screaming at this child that's done nothing other than, you know, wake up screaming every night for the past 6 months. But you know, deep down, she can't control that. Like, she's not trying to drive me insane, but it feels like it in that moment, and you lose it. And then you have to deal with the guilt and the shame associated with losing it. And it's just this horrible, horrible cycle of like never ending gross. And people don't talk about that really ugly aspect of it. Like, and the advice I would get a lot of the times was just enjoy it. This won't last forever, you know, and try and think of it as this is just extra time to cuddle your kid. And it was like, that is the least helpful thing I think anybody has ever said to me. Like, just enjoy it. Like,
that is the worst advice, I think, just across the board that people give parents. They only ever say that when it is a moment that no one will miss. And, you know, like when the kid, I remember when it was a different thing for me, but when my son was potty training, it was just constantly 2 steps forward and, you know, 3 steps back. And people would be like, oh, just enjoy it. Enjoy every moment because it'll be over soon. And I'm like, what part of him pissing on my foot am I going to miss? I'm like, you're not, there are so many things you can have moments you're going to miss. And there are still moments you would be like, I'm really glad that's over.
Yep, no, I mean, these are moments that like, I'm not going to wish on my worst enemy. Yeah.
No, like what you just described, like why in the world would you ever miss driving and being like, oh, I wasn't awake for this drive. Where was I? Like, why would I miss that? Nobody's going to miss that. That's, I mean,
there's nothing about the day I get fired.
Fired, or even worse, if you crash your car. Yeah. Like, there's nothing about that you're going to miss. Why would you miss that? I don't, like, I understand what people are trying to say. They're like, you're going to miss them this small. And there are things about them being small that, you know, you're going to miss. But there's a difference between you're going to miss them when they're small and giving some sort of condescending advice like what they gave you. Like, oh, I know you haven't slept in a year, but enjoy it now. You'll miss it. You're going to miss
just enjoying to sleep. Well, and I don't think anything can possibly make you feel more inadequate as a parent than basically being told you should just love your situation more. Like,
you should just love it. Because then you start wondering, like, do other people love it? Like, am I missing something? Like, is everybody else really happy with this?
Well, and that's where I was kind of like, that's one of the reasons that I wrote that article, was because I felt like, I know that I'm not the only person that is going through this, but I think that it's such an ugly place to be that nobody wants to talk about it. And we need to be able to talk about the really, really ugly stuff. Like, there's funny stuff and there's cute stuff and there's adorable stuff and there's messy stuff and gross stuff, but there's also really, really hard stuff. And we have to be able to talk about the really, really hard stuff openly and honestly with each other. Because if we don't, then you end up like me, in a fetal position in a corner, convinced that like you're the worst person on the face of the planet because nobody else has been honest with you about this side potentially of parenting.
I remember you talking about it. You felt so isolated. Like, you were talking about how isolated you felt the whole time, and it was so hard to see. And part of that problem is because nobody had talked to you about it. Did you ever wind up running into anybody who was going through the same thing as you?
So once I wrote that piece for you, I did. Like, that's when I finally ran into some people, because it got shared a couple of places. And so I saw some comments on some different places, Facebook and places like that, where people shared stories that were really, really similar to mine, and also shared like that same sense of isolation, because it isn't every kid that has sleeping problems, right? Like, most kids start sleeping at some point during their first year. They start going through really long periods of sleep. But even if it's only 5%, 10% of kids that are really, really poor sleepers, that's still a lot out there, right? Like, there's a large number of babies at any given time. So even a small percentage accounts for a large number of kids. Everybody's just kind of dispersed. So they have to be able to find each other.
Right. And how else are we going to find each other, like, if we don't talk, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
That, I'm really glad you did. I'm really glad you did, because I know that was something that you were struggling with. And it was like to the point where none of us wanted to ever talk about if we got any sleep the night before.
Right.
Do you remember that? We would be like, yeah, I got some sleep. Oh, Bonnie's here. Never mind. We didn't. No, I didn't. I haven't slept well in ever, because we didn't want you to feel like, it was so hard, because we didn't want you to feel alone. And you would be like, no, it's okay. But behind your eyes, we could tell that it wasn't okay. Right. So I'm really glad that you wound up finding your people. That's so important.
Yeah. Well, and like the support system is huge, and like having people that you can rely on to be there for you and talk to you about things, and like be able to be, even if people haven't shared that experience, like being able to be honest and open about that experience was hugely important. Like, even if people didn't have, they couldn't really empathize with the situation, but they could be there for me and support me. And they came over sometimes and watched my kid and let me sleep. And that was big too. Please do that. If you have somebody that's struggling with sleep deprivation, go watch their kid. Let them take a nap. It's good.
That's very important. Go watch their child. Yeah.
Yes.
That was always great. Having a group of people who are not going to judge you for talking about your struggles is really huge and surprisingly hard to find. Speaking as a person who had to move away from you guys and is still working on that myself, I can totally, completely attest to the fact that is not easy to find.
So here's the thing about not being able to sleep. Once you have kids, it does seem as if it's taken much less seriously. It's spoken about as if the presence of a baby makes that tiredness all worth it. And I think what Bonnie and I are trying to say here is that sentiment is straight bullshit. We have sleep debt just like everyone else. And studies have shown that the average parent will lose sleep for up to the first 6 years of their child's life. Mothers generally lose 40 minutes of sleep a night, and fathers lose about 18 minutes on average. While that may not sound like a lot, those minutes add up. And that's on average. So imagine what it must be like for people whose children follow odd sleep patterns. People like Bonnie. And I'm sure there's someone out there. There's always one person, at least, who tries to say that we shouldn't complain because we chose to have children in the first place. And to that someone, or someones, I say, get out of here with your sanctimony. Unless you gladly accept all struggles associated with all choices you've ever made, you don't get to speak on whether or not a person has the right to complain, or whether or not their struggles are valid. Loving your child doesn't mean loving every part of parenthood, and anyone who says otherwise is probably not a real person. You should probably stop taking advice from cartoon characters. Take some advice from Bonnie, though, who says that there is an importance in accepting help when it's offered.
This is going to sound crazy. If I were to go back and do it again, first of all, I think one of the things that was really difficult for me was I was breastfeeding, which, go breastfeeding mamas. It's awesome if you can do it, like all the support in the world. If I were to go back and do it again, if the situation were the same, I think I probably would have handed over at least some of that responsibility earlier on, so that I could share night wakings with my husband and not feel like I had to be personally responsible for every single time she was awake. So like delegating in some different ways, the responsibility of being up with a kid. If I could go back and do it again, honestly, I probably would have done that differently. I think it took me a long time to be really vocal, like outside of my really close group of friends, about how I was feeling. And I think we need to be able to tell people around us that we deal with daily, but aren't necessarily our close friends. Like if we're in a work environment, we need to be able to share, not necessarily the nitty gritty, but we need to be able to express like, look, hey, my work may not be up to par, and this is why. Like we need to be able to have those conversations about mental health in general, in the workplace and in different environments without feeling like we're talking about something taboo. And I wish I had come to realize that way sooner, because it did take me some time to share that, like outside of my really, really close groups of friends. Beyond that, like just relying on people, and ignoring the nonsense, like ignoring people feel like they all have the answer, and none of them do. Nobody knows. They know their own situation. And I wish that I had spent a lot less time trying to figure out the perfect answer and more time just relying on a network of people to support me.
That's like, that last bit is probably my favorite thing, because asking for help is probably one of the biggest struggles we have just in general as parents. I think mothers especially, we're just not good at asking for help like at all. And I think really comes from this place of like, I'm afraid that if I admit that I need help, people are going to assume that I can't handle raising my kids, or they're going to, think that I'm soft, or they're going to be like, what's wrong with you? I'm able to handle this thing. And, you really have to be able to, not to get all kumbaya, but I think that you have to be able to rely on one another to a degree. Like you said, you have to be able to rely on one another enough to go to a boss and be like, listen, I haven't slept and I am, horribly depressed, and my work's just not going to be where it needs to be, without worrying that your boss is going to judge you. And you actually may not remember this because you were kind of like clearly in and out of existence, but you were actually, I was really proud of how open you were, as much as you were. I know that you weren't as much as you would have liked to have been, but you still talked about it to a degree that I think most people would still be afraid to do, which was great, because I feel like you opened a door for a conversation that needed to be had.
So I talk about it probably surprisingly frequently, considering that my kid's 4 now, no longer a child. Although, in the grand scheme of things, it's only been like a year since she really started sleeping well. So it's still relatively recent. But yeah, I mention it pretty frequently, especially when I have friends that are new parents and they're struggling with their kids' sleep. I won't necessarily share my story, but I'll offer to share it. I'll say, if you ever, want to talk to somebody about how hard it can be, like, let me know, we can talk. I don't want to present it because, you know how it is when you're pregnant or you're a new mom and everybody has the horror stories that they want to share. I don't want to be that person. It's not like, this is what your kid's going to be like. Your kid's never going to sleep. Why did you do this?
Life is about to want for you.
Right. I don't want to be the bearer of like doom news, but I do want to be available.
Mary, welcome now.
Right. Yes. What have you done? but I do want to be there as like that person that is available to talk. And I do, like, I'll share it when it pops up in my memories. I'll reshare it because it always seems to start a new conversation, right? Like every time I reshare it, somebody that hasn't seen it before sees it and comments on it and says, "Oh, I had this experience," or "Oh, my baby slept perfectly, but my sister had a horrible time sleeping." So I try and keep the conversation going because I do think it's an important one to have, and I do think all of them are important. Like when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety, and not even related to kids, just like I said, mental health in general is a conversation that gets brushed away way too frequently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an important one to have. And it's one that I think should be kept at the forefront. So yeah, I do try and bring light to it. Without terrifying people, but just in a way of, hey, this can happen. And if it does, that doesn't make you crazy and it doesn't make you not normal. It just means that you're going through an experience that really sucks.
Yeah. And people need that. They really do. I mean, that's why this exists, right? Like that's why this started. That's why, I started out working with you and the other friends in our group was because we all came together specifically because we were like, are we the only ones, or are we alone in this? And we needed somebody to hold on to say, no, you're not alone. You're not the only person who does X or Y, or, and we needed people who were willing to say that without automatically offering suggestions or automatically like trying to tell us that we did it wrong or judging us. And that's great.
Mm-hmm.
That is my point. Because like, I feel like a lot of people kind of feel like, oh, I said this once and that's enough. I've done my job. I've said what I've said. And I don't know. I kind of try to, a lot of the time there's a lot of repeating myself when I say certain things. And that's because I feel like just because one or two people heard it, there's still probably another 10 or 15 more or 100 more or 1,000 more who didn't hear it the first time and they need to hear it. So I think that's amazing. And I'm glad you're getting sleep now, by the way.
Yes. Me too.
Wonderfully well rested.
I am. I'm a whole person. It's crazy.
And why would you ever want to lose that at this point? So I totally and completely get why you wouldn't want to go through that again.
I wouldn't, which is only having
exactly.
one.
And that's totally fine. As someone who has 2 kids, I sometimes wonder why I didn't just stop at 1. And I love them both to death, but I'm just like, oh my God, I'm listening to this in stereo. So I totally get it.
And finally, if you take any advice away from this conversation, take this.
You're doing the best you can, and that's okay, and that it's not easy. But as much as it sucks to hear, it does end eventually. And I think ultimately to give yourself grace and just try and be kind to yourself through the process because you didn't do anything to create the situation and it's not your fault.
If you'd like to read Bonnie's article, it's linked in the show notes. And finally, as I've mentioned, this will be our last episode of 2019. And we will be returning January 13th of 2020. Before we sign off for the year, I just wanted to thank every single set of ears listening to us out there for supporting us, for spreading the word about us, and for believing in us for the 4 short months that we've existed already. You've helped us cross the threshold of 1,000 listens already, and you've chosen to give moms just like you a voice. We're thankful to you in such huge ways, and I, for one, am excited beyond excited to show you what's coming up in 2020. Thank you, happy holidays, and may you have the brightest of New Year's. The NYAM Project podcast is written and produced by me, Ariana Bradford. You can find out more about us at wearenyam.com or on social media under the NYAM Project. Thank you to Bonnie for giving us some of her time today, and we'll see you next year.